anyone out there who is wondering why the name of Ruth appears in Jesus' genealogy, then I'm here to tell you why. Now, my name is Naomi, and the book that bears Ruth's name is also part of my story. Now, you might wonder why dear Ruth is not speaking for herself. And the reason is that she doesn't like to toot her own horn, so to speak, to tell everyone what she did. And so because she won't tell everyone that she is a worthy woman, that she demonstrated God's faithfulness, God's loving kindness all throughout her life, then I will tell it for her. Because Ruth came onto the scene in the midst of my own tragic story. I was once full. I had a husband and 2 sons, but then came the famine in our hometown of Bethlehem. 1 year of poor crops turned to 2, turned to 3, turned into there was no food anywhere, even if you had money to buy it, because there was none to buy. The word famine should strike fear into the hearts of about anyone, and it's only when you live a secure life that you can dismiss that word casually, given the number of people that suffer and even die, even in your world today, from famine. And my husband Elimelech chose to run from the famine, to migrate to another place, another land where there might possibly be food, where we wouldn't go to bed hungry every night and watch our 2 sons languish before our eyes. And so we went to Moab, of all places. Now, the name Moab might not mean anything much to you, but we can comfortably say that people from Moab did not get along with people from Judah, which was where I was from. My people considered Moabites to be backward, boorish, pagan idolaters. But Moab had food, and Judah did not. And so we joined the line of the destitute seeking a way out of Bethlehem, which had become a hopeless place for us. We went to a place where we might at least find some food to feed our little family. And Moab did have food, but it was hardly the land of promise, at least not for me, because my troubles continued there. The public tragedy of the famine that had displaced many gave way to my own deeply personal tragedy. Moab took my husband from me. And so there I was, a stranger in a strange land, and now I was a widow too. By now you are wondering why I am spinning this tragic tale, telling you all the terrible things that happened to me when this is supposed to be a story about Ruth. Well, that's because this is the place in my tragedy where Ruth came into my life. Now, I was a widower, a foreigner in this land, and so I had little left to bargain with. But I did the best I could, and I was able to acquire a wife for each of my 2 sons. And the 2 wives that I was able to acquire were named Orpah and Ruth. But even then, with the marriage of my 2 sons, things didn't actually get much better. My 2 sons, when they were married off, I figured maybe we could settle down and I would be the happy grandmother of a brood of grandchildren. But that was not to be. Month after month, we expected happy news from these 2 couples, but month after month we were disappointed. Neither of my daughters-in-law were able to conceive children, and after 10 long years of marriage, my sons and I and these wonderful women had just given up. But the land of Moab was not finished with me yet. It finally took from me not only my husband, but my sons as well. So there we were, a household of 3 widows, 3 hungry women to feed in a world where attachment to a man was everything. What was there to do? I was in despair. I was completely empty. What did I have left that the Lord could even take from me? Because this is how I thought, that the Lord had taken these things from me, and if I was empty because God caused it to be so. My tragic life had not made me abandon my belief that God existed. It had, however, made me abandon my former belief that God was good and cared for his people. And so it was in this place that I heard the news that there was food again in Bethlehem. And I figured that if I was going to die anyway, I might as well die among my family, at home, not in this foreign place. And so I started out for Bethlehem with Ruth and Orpah in tow. As we began to journey, however, I realized that while Bethlehem was my home, it was certainly not home for my daughters-in-law. They were on their way to becoming what I had been, a stranger, a foreigner, living among a people you don't trust and certainly don't even like that much. Forced to behave and interact and to speak and even maybe to worship in unfamiliar and even hostile ways. Subject to the mistrust we save for outsiders, the sidelong glances, the opposition that comes from being from a different place and of a different people. As those memories of my early days in Moab resurfaced, I began to realize that I didn't want for these two women, who had become all the close family that I had left, my companions and even my friends. I did not want this for them. Not only this, but if my prospects in Bethlehem were not terribly promising, I was essentially going there to die at home. Theirs were even worse than mine. They were younger than me, and even though they had not produced children in their marriages to my sons, there was the possibility that they still could produce children with someone else, but no one that I could provide for them. And so I urged them there on the road to Bethlehem to turn around and to go back to their mothers' homes in Moab, where they might at least find a chance, a future, maybe make a match. And this is where Ruth began to shine. As I urged the girls to return home, at first they both refused to go, and with tears they entreated me to let them stay, but I urged them all the more. I really believe that going back to Moab was their best option. And after all this, Orpah did turn back. And I say this with no judgment upon her. She was only doing what I told her to do, what I honestly thought was best for them. But Ruth, stubborn Ruth, dear Ruth, refused to leave. And she treated me to an oath of beautiful words that are still preserved in the wedding ceremonies of some today. Though I wonder if people realize that these words were definitely spoken in the for poorer parts of relationships. Ruth showed great loyalty to me on that road to Bethlehem, going toward the home that was my home, but was not her home. She turned to me and said, "Don't force me to leave you. Don't make me go home. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I'll live. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. Where you die, I'll die, and that's where I'll be buried. So help me God, not even death is going to come between us." Those beautiful words that today people in love speak to one another at a wedding ceremony, Ruth spoke to me. This broken down, emptied out old widow who was simply going home so that she could die among familiar people and familiar faces. And not only did Ruth show loyalty to me on the road to Bethlehem, but Ruth accepted my God, Yahweh, as her God too on the road to Bethlehem. How unexpected, how wonderful that Ruth would choose to serve God on that road from Moab to Bethlehem after seeing everything that had happened to me. I was her only witness. How marvelous that it would be me, who really had nothing good at all to say about God at that point in my life, and who was even trying to send her away, who was the one to bring Ruth to faith in God. But the thing is, Ruth was as good as her word. She refused to leave me. And then, when we woke up on Bethlehem, my home, which had never been her home, she wasted no time in getting up, going out, and doing the back-breaking work of gleaning grain, which is picking up stalks of grain that fall out when harvesters are trying to bundle them together. Ruth did that ordinary work that people all over the world do every single day. She went out to put food on the table. And that first day that she went out to glean, she by chance chose the field of one Boaz, who treated her very kindly, allowing her to break convention and gather grain amidst the harvesters, not just what had been left behind when they'd been through. And he even instructed his harvesters to pull out stalks from the sheaves as they gathered them to allow her to glean even more. And Boaz even offered her a hot lunch. And my dear Ruth only ate a little bit of that lunch so she could pack up the rest and bring it home to me. And so after that first day of gleaning, Ruth came home with so much grain she could hardly carry it, and a hot meal for me to eat right then and there. Now, if I'm completely honest with you, I did not know the gem that I had in Ruth right away. I was too consumed with my own brokenness, my own emptiness, that at first I almost ignored Ruth. But after that first day when she was gleaning grain, when she came home with more food than I ever believed she could have gathered in a single day, I asked her whose field she'd gleaned in that day. And when she gave the name Boaz, that was when I first sensed the first shaft of light breaking through my clouds of despair. There's a saying that says a miracle is an instance in which God chooses to remain anonymous. Or that is, a coincidence is an instance in which God chooses to remain anonymous. And that is what this seemed to be. God chose to remain anonymous when seemingly by chance Ruth picked this particular field belonging to this particular man to glean on that first day. It was the first indication to me that maybe God really hadn't forgotten about me, and maybe he really was looking out for me yet. All throughout that summer, throughout that harvesting season, Ruth gathered grain. She did so even though it was dangerous for her. As a foreigner, she was ripe for people to take advantage of her. And as a woman, she was at risk from men who were less than savory, as some of those who are day laborers and harvesters are. But she went anyway. It was hard, sweaty, back-breaking work, but Ruth did it each and every day without complaint. And so it was that we ate for our first season here in Bethlehem. But when that season of harvest began to draw to a close, I began to wonder if maybe we could do better. Maybe I could do better for dear Ruth than simply subsisting on whatever food she could find in a given day. And so I hatched a risky plan that, should it succeed, would secure her future and mine. But should it fail, she would be subject to shame and reproach and probably ruin all hope of a future that she had here in Bethlehem. But dear Ruth was so faithful that when I suggested this plan, as dangerous as it was, she agreed. And she went to the threshing floor at night, and she did everything that I told her. And she spoke to Boaz, who, as it turns out, himself was a man of valor and worth. If Ruth showed great kindness to me, and she did, I can say nothing more praiseworthy of Boaz than that he showed great kindness to Ruth. Instead of using this midnight situation on the threshing floor to his own advantage, Boaz agreed to Ruth's bold proposal of marriage. But it was then that there was a wrench thrown in the works. There was another closer relative that could fill the role that we were hoping Boaz would play. And so when Ruth returned home that night, she and I had to wait to see how things would play out. But we didn't have to wait very long. The very next morning, Boaz convened a meeting in the town square in which he did a deal with Mr. So-and-so, who was perfectly content if he could expand his property to gain a little more money, but wasn't so keen on it if Ruth were part of the bargain. But Boaz was less concerned with property than with my precious daughter-in-law, whom he himself acknowledged was a woman of valor, a woman of great character, a faithful woman. And so he and Mr. So-and-so struck a deal. And so it was, when the deal was concluded, Ruth and Boaz were married. And even though Ruth had been unable to conceive a child when she was married to my son, within record time Ruth was pregnant, and she had a son whom they called Obed, but he was more commonly known out throughout the village as Naomi's boy. And so it was that I went from empty to full because of the faithfulness of my dear Ruth. And that is why I sing her praises, and why I know to the very core of my being that Ruth deserves her place in the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. Late in my story, after the birth of Obed, the women of Bethlehem say, "Praise to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Often people think the book of Ruth is a love story between Ruth and Boaz. But the only mention of the word love is here, where the people of Bethlehem point out how Ruth loves Naomi, me. This broken down old widow is the object of Ruth's great love and loyalty. There's a wonderful word in Hebrew for the kind of love that God has for his people. According to Scripture, God is a God of kindness, mercy, loyalty, loving kindness, loyal, steadfast, unfailing, or just plain love. Those are all translations of this one word in Hebrew. And during those dark days in my life, I wondered if God's loving kindness had run out for me. And I got my answer. The answer came not through burning bushes or walking on sea like dry land. The answer came not through the voices of prophets or visions and dreams. The answer, in short, did not come through any kind of miracle that we might recognize as a miracle. It came through the faithfulness of people, God's servants, bearers of God's image. My answer began with Ruth. Ruth agreed to take the risk of encountering Boaz on the threshing floor. Even the danger to her was great. Her body and her reputation were on the line. But Ruth poured herself out for me. And because she did so, I finally knew that God really loved me. I knew because he showed his loving kindness to me in the face of Ruth. And God showed great love to Ruth through Boaz. Because of these two faithful people, but most especially through my dear Ruth, I saw the loving face of God. Now Ruth had many strikes against her in her life. When she came to Bethlehem in my wake, she was a foreigner there. She was a widow. She was even barren. We were nearly destitute and had almost no resources. She's an unlikely person to pick to show the face of God. But you can look up a definition in the dictionary all you want about what the definition of love is. But if you want to know what love looks like, look at the story of Ruth. Look at what Ruth did for me, and you'll see. And so my story, which started out in the bitter years of my life, which left me empty, ends here, with the abundant harvest in storehouses, with blessings overflowing, with a new birth, with new life, where before there was only emptiness. I was the grandmother of a bouncing baby boy who was forever known as Naomi's boy because we were rarely separated. And this came about through the loving kindness of God, which was on full display in the lives and actions of Boaz and dear Ruth. Now they were not superhuman. They were just ordinary people who demonstrated extraordinary love and faithfulness. But as it turns out, that wasn't quite the end of my story after all. This story is a great story in and of itself, but if we stop at the birth of our baby boy, it's not really a story of the gospel. But from God's perspective, our stories were bigger than we ever could have imagined. This was not a private love story, but a story in which of the ways in which God was redeeming the world. It's a story that God has been writing for a long time, and one that he even continues to write today. Obed had a child who became a man who also had a son, and then he had a grandson. And that grandson was none other than the greatest king that Israel ever knew, King David. Ruth was a foreign widow who followed another bitter widow through the gates of Bethlehem. The fact that Ruth managed to scrape together a survival at all is something of a miracle. But the fact that Ruth is a key person in the production of one of the greatest kings of Israel is beyond even the miraculous. It goes to show you the strange and wonderful ways that God works in the world. And the miracle, the overflow of blessing, does not stop there because, as we've already said, right at the beginning, Ruth does not quite disappear from the pages of Scripture once you turn to 1 Samuel in your Bibles. Because Matthew, the Gospel writer, many years later includes Ruth in his ancestors of Jesus the Messiah. So Ruth not only ended up being part of the vital story of King David, she ends up being vital to the story of the birth of the one who is going to save the entire world. Sometimes we think that our ordinary stories, our ordinary lives will never amount to anything, will never be of any eternal value or of any value to God. But if you think that, I want you to think about me, bitter and broken, who turned out to be full and blessed. And I want you most especially to think about Ruth, foreign, an outsider, who becomes the great-grandmother of King David, and a mother vital to the line of Jesus the Messiah. Because God not only can, but God does use everyone in the story that he's writing. The story that he's writing to save the entire world.